You are tuned into Gothcast, a half-satirical podcast.
Glovecast lives. I apologize for not really getting any content out in the last, 6 months. Had a lot going on. Had quite a bit going on. But today I am going to... this is going to be my take on the recent Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek debate on capitalism, Marxism, and happiness. And it's also going to be in part a response to or a response video mainly toward, I believe it's pronounced, I'm going to call it Xelasoma's analysis of the debate, which is it's a pretty good analysis, and he offers a really interesting take on it. And there was one phrase in there that kind of stuck with me, and that's called the mythology of liberal capitalism. So if you haven't watched the debate yet, I recommend finding a few hours to kill to watch it, even if you're doing nothing on a Saturday or something. It's a really good debate, and if you've watched the debate and you haven't watched Xelasoma's response, I recommend that as well. So at this point, I think most people who are listening, and most people in general, if you're kind of savvy with internet culture, you probably have a vague, familiar idea of who Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek represent and who they are as people. Peterson, he's been kind of a hot commodity in the past few years, but he's been pretty controversial. There's been people who really like him, and then people who really, really do not like him. So, for all intents and purposes, for this discussion, I'm going to assume that you know who both of them are. So, with Peterson, for all intents and purposes, he is the quote-unquote right wing in this discussion. And I know many of his fans, but not so much his detractors, would disagree with the statement that he is right wing. But he's coming to the table promoting essentially the superiority of capitalism over Marxism in terms of helping one achieve self-actualization. So Jordan Peterson, his big proponency, I guess, it's individualism, and he sees cultural Christianity or Judeo-Christian values, a phrase which, honestly, I fucking hate. It's kind of a social adhesive for Western countries that promote individualism. So, in a way, you can almost view that as a type of collective individualism. So, Peterson, he really resonated with me for a while. I found most value in his self-help, and I found him to be a good introduction to kind of more interesting thinkers and not necessarily thinkers he espouses, so like Plato and Thomas Aquinas. I thought his radical individualism for a time was the best way to self-actualization. And I like that one thing I really did like about him, and I still kind of do like about him, is I like that he espouses politics as something other than the fight for rights. But as of this current point in time, I think Zizek has more interesting things to say. So, about a year ago, this debate was teased, and since that point, I was kind of calling it, if it was actually going to come into fruition, if it was actually a debate in the traditional sense of the word, where one party wins and the other party loses, I predicted that Zizek would wipe the floor with Peterson, and the reason I say that is because to his background as an actual philosopher who has dealt with the issues of capitalism, communism, and happiness extensively, honestly. I'm not super familiar with Zizek's work, but that much I kind of was familiar with. So, in this debate, Zizek represented the Marxist side as a self-proclaimed Marxist, but first and foremost, before that, he declares himself a Hegelian. So, Zizek's reason for claiming the title of Marxist was because of Marx's critiques of capitalism, which, frankly, he saw as kind of strong and honest critiques. So, a few examples of Marx's critiques of capitalism, they include the alienation of the worker from the product of his labor, and the private ownership of property causing the owners of capital to kind of get richer while the poor get poorer. So, Zizek also notes that Marx was intellectually honest enough to list several counter tendencies that could potentially happen as well as a result of worker alienation. So I see this practice right here as kind of similar to what Thomas Aquinas did in his Summa Theologica, where Aquinas would list out counterpoints to his points and then proceed to refute the counterpoints using Aristotelian scholasticism. With all of this said, Zizek defines himself more as a Hegelian than a Marxist due to what he refers as Hegel's openness, and Zizek promotes the radical openness as a type of antidote to our current cultural condition, where we're culturally drifting aimlessly without a purpose, unsure of where we are, and unsure of where we're headed. So, viewed as a promotion of Petersonian self-authoring on a macro scale, and he views philosophy as kind of the best way to promote this kind of openness. So, the discussion between Peterson and Zizek was framed as a debate, and if you would still like to frame it that way, I kind of have a few problems with the way that's framed, but if you would still like to frame it that way, I would say that Zizek won really for a few reasons. It's by virtue of getting people interested in ideas that previously they would have considered unconsiderable. So, like I said earlier, Peterson, he's been a kind of a hot commodity for a few years now, but by this point, most people who have heard of him understand kind of what he espouses and kind of what he's about. So, his big thing is personal responsibility, individualism, freedom of speech, a very big skepticism towards contemporary progressivism, classical liberalism. He's described himself as a classical British liberal. And then he's also acknowledged the acknowledgement of Western countries' intellectual and cultural indebtedness to Christianity. So that's kind of the basis of where Jordan Peterson stands in his thought, and whether it's a message that you agree or disagree with, even if you're passingly familiar with Jordan Peterson, you're aware of what it is he's ideologically promoting. So if this is still being framed as a debate, this could almost be viewed as Peterson has been lost before he started, simply by nature of his fame. So in this debate, he had a little bit more to lose coming to the table as opposed to Zizek. Zizek, I know he's kind of been in the cultural kind of spotlight for a while, but not to the degree and centralization that Peterson has. So, like I said, he wasn't unheard of prior to this debate, since he too has been in the public spotlight for a much longer and much less centralized fashion. But most people who have heard of Zizek, they also have kind of a good idea of his shtick. So it's kind of an unorthodox communist with an awareness of ideology. And so that's kind of where Peterson and Zizek kind of both fall into play. They proclaim, I think Zizek a little bit more than Peterson, but Zizek, he's created like he's the pervert's guide to ideology, where he just kind of points out the poison and trash can of ideology. And Peterson he's made a similar statement when he says he's called out people who are supposedly possessed by an ideology. So, with that said, the consensus of the debate seems to be that Zizek won over more fans than Peterson and got people to acknowledge Marxism, something that they previously would not have considered. But I don't think the concept of debate is necessarily useful anymore at this current point in time with regards to the Peter-Zizek discussion or in general. So in Xelasoma's response video, he notes that the debates are not often particularly useful in actually exploring new ideas, since in debates it's not necessarily the best ideas that win, but the most rhetorically advanced debater. So in theory, debates should be, quote-unquote, the fighting ground of ideas, where the best ideas hold out, and by their very nature, they can kind of squash all of the other ideas because they are just superior. But one should also note that in these debates, they're often public spectacles, or at least spectacles that involve some sort of audience. And each party in a debate has already established ethos with each member of the audience in some way, shape, or form. So what I'm kind of saying here is that each person who has come to the debate with a convicted presupposition, and these days it's often very strong presuppositions, but with that said, this turns debates into kind of almost a sporting match, a competition, if you will, where your guy is kind of pitted against the other guy, and everybody in the audience is kind of rooting for their guy, and really no minds are actually changed. It seems in the social media age, they're kind of swamped with these convictions. So the beauty of the internet is it gives you enough confirmation bias that you really don't have to see anything you dislike if that's what you want. So if you really wanted to, I know that people are trying to kind of extend olive branches and see that, but really when it comes to debate, a lot of people, they come to it with this idea that their guy is kind of gonna win. It's almost like a boxing match or something. So the thing of it is, though, Peterson and Zizek actually agreed on quite a bit, and they disagreed on a decent amount as well. But the entirety of the debate, I would frame it more in terms of a Hegelian dialectic than it was an actual formal debate. And so with that said, you could almost view Zizek as also being the winner on those grounds, as controlling the narrative of the so-called debate before it actually began, because he himself is kind of a self-described Hegelian. So what this means is, think of the Peterson-Zizek debate and choose whichever guy you align with more for whatever reason. So the capitalist Peterson or the Marxist Zizek. And view him as the thesis of the debate, or the point of the debate, the reason the debate is being had. So the quote-unquote other guy would be viewed as the antithesis, the reaction, the counterpoint, and the resulting product of those two. It's kind of the point and counterpoint coming together to get more or less a super point. So it's, think of it as the thesis, antithesis, coming together to become a synthesis. So it's a Hegelian synthesis of the two ideas. Peterson has acknowledged that the dialectic on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he says something along the lines of the two of them building something greater than themselves when having a discussion. So if this debate resembled the Hegelian dialectic, with the Hegelian's Zizek's thesis closer to the synthesis than Peterson's antithesis, one could view that Zizek won on those grounds, since the consensus seems to be he elucidated the audience more than Peterson did. So while I don't believe the synthesis was explicitly stated at any point during the debate, but you could kind of come to that conclusion that that's kind of what was going on. So anyways, enough of this kind of debate stuff. So really the reason why we're here is we're trying to figure out which system is better for achieving long-term happiness, and what is this mythology of liberal capitalism I talked about. So both Zizek and Peterson agree that happiness should not be the goal, and that people who want happiness often simply want all of the benefits of happiness without any of the drawbacks. So I believe that Peterson and Zizek come at the happiness angle from 2 points that are similar, but not quite the same thing. So with regards to happiness, Peterson espouses the meaning and responsibility should supersede happiness as such, because happiness is oftentimes just fleeting and comes with drawbacks, such as, frankly, being quite stupid when you're happy, his words. So Peterson says something to the effect of, you cannot will yourself to be happy, but you can will yourself to be unhappy. And his goal to achieve the closest thing to happiness is to, and I quote, stand on the edge of what you know, and to expand on your domain of knowledge and ability, so that you're not only acting in an efficient manner, but you're increasing the efficiency and productivity and meaningfulness of what it is you're engaged in. So, knowing what we know of Peterson as the pro-capitalist side of the debate or argument, whatever the hell you want to call it, you can see his capitalism kind of entrenched in that answer to the question of true, sincere happiness. So, responsibility, acting efficiently and productively to find meaning in whatever it is you're engaged in. So, in a way, it reminds me of the opening lyrics to the Radiohead song Fitter, Happier. So, if you haven't heard that, it's a darkly satirical song with dystopian anti-capitalist undertones. So, fitter, happier, more productive, not drinking too much, regular exercise at the gym 3 times a week. With this said, when you truly become aware and act in such a way that you are the arbiter of your destiny, the master of your own domain, the internalization of your locus of control, so to speak, your life will get better and you will be, quote-unquote, happier. So I'm surprised Peterson has never really touched on the internal and external locus of control, since that's kind of a psychological element that directly correlates with well-being. So essentially it translates to, do you or does something else outside of your control what happens to you? So I think Peterson, he is on to something here. He knows that the desire to shoulder responsibility as one of the deepest human impulses that exists, so before the logical impulse, which frankly, is something I can agree with Peterson on. I think humans, as to reduce us to logical beings, that is just patently false. I don't think we are. I think we're very irrational beings. So, where Peterson talks of meaning and responsibility, Zizek talks on love and falling in love. So, to fall is to essentially be a shocking event. Nobody really falls on purpose. And to fall in love is to take a risk, to be sincere, to have passion scare you. So Zizek notes the Christian framework of the West, but he believes that the dichotomy of Christianity and atheism, and being the jokester Zizek is known to be, he notes the ultimate religious joke told by Christianity, the joke of the suffering God. So, on the cross, for a brief moment, the ultimate being, or being itself, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent being itself, is suffering and dying, an act not normally associated with the all-powerful. So, God literally dies on the cross, and when God dies, God no longer is, which is where the atheism comes in. So, Christianity is the first instance to tell the joke of the suffering God, the dead God, the God that no longer is. This is what is known as Zizek's death of God theology, and he notes that man's separation from God is ironically part of divinity itself, with the Holy Spirit simply being the community that arose surrounding the death of God. So the Holy Spirit is essentially the Christian community that united itself around the death of God. Now, for Zizek, the pursuit of the blissful state of happiness is futile. You can see Zizek's Marxist collectivism shining through his interpretation of Christian theology, which is interesting given the communal ascetic nature of early Christianity. But Zizek also notes collective responsibility in addition to personal responsibility, noting that the two can be practiced simultaneously. To quote Parquet Courts on Total Football, collectivism and autonomy are not mutually exclusive. So, with all of this said, I think Peterson gave a more appropriate answer to the question of happiness, since his answer was an attempt at a solution, whereas Zizek struck me as more of a diagnosis on why there is a crisis of happiness. So, he quotes Peterson's rule about setting your house in perfect order before criticizing the world, but notes that the reason there could potentially be disorder in the house may have to do with society at large. So that may not necessarily be the fault of the individual as such, which, when he says that, he kind of emphasizes the need for collective responsibility in addition to personal responsibility. So on all of this, one should note that both men often agree with each other on a lot more than they disagree, which is why to frame this as a debate isn't particularly honest or helpful. So both recognize the utility of responsibility and have a deep interest in Christianity culturally. Zizek acknowledges the disastrousness of the 20th century communist states, something Peterson would agree with, without ceding the territory from Marxist ideology. So both note the toxicity of PC culture and note that Trump is not a fascist. At some point, Zizek makes an interesting point to the effect that the dominant ethos of the West is a type of secular consumerist Buddhism, where we're sufficiently detached from everything and seek to replace it with consumerist goods. With all of this said, let's get to the meat of the video, what Xelasoma called the mythology of liberal capitalism. He makes an interesting point that liberal capitalist society subscribes to itself a type of existential promise towards the good life, something similar to a cult-like system like Scientology, where you cannot buy simply into part of the system. You must jump into it head first, making it the essence of your being, why you exist. So it makes the false promise that one must enslave themselves temporarily in order to truly emancipate themselves, when in reality this enslaves them further. So it is both the genius and tyranny of the liberal capitalist project. And he notes this is kind of genius, which frankly it kind of is. Why succumb yourself to the tyranny of kings and tyrants when you yourself could become your own tyrant within this liberal capitalist system? So this right here is the core tenet of the liberal capitalist mythology. So you enslave yourself now to emancipate yourself later, when in reality it enslaves you further. So With this, it comes with a variety of other tenets as well, if you view it in terms of mythology. So, it believes itself to be so desirable that it must be spread wherever it doesn't exist so it can free the inhabitants of those areas and enlighten them with their liberal mythology. So, view it in terms of as a unit of culture, as a meme, so to speak, kind of a very powerful flippin' meme that just wants to spread itself as much as possible. So, similarly, liberalism views itself as a proponent of world peace and anti-war, at least as anti-war as these kinds of states can get, when liberal states have declared war more frequently than the monarchist states before them. Xelasoma notes the effectiveness of the liberal capitalist project with regards to harnessing technology and the means of communication. So it uses information age technology to successfully replicate itself towards every corner of the globe, reinforcing its own success. So it's an instance, in terms of the mythology itself, it's an instance where the myth teller or the priest of the mythology, so to speak, and the myth itself become one and the same. So I'm not trained philosophically, so forgive me if this comes off as stupid, but with regards to capitalism, I believe Marx saw capitalism as a type of intermediary step before capital was abolished totally in some way, whether it be by revolution or how have you. And you can kind of view this as similar to how Nietzsche described nihilism. So he described nihilism as a necessary intermediary step of valuelessness between the era of the values of old, aka the values given to us by God, in the era where man would have the ability to create his own values. So if one equates capitalism and nihilism's intermediary natures, one could make the big brain hot take that capitalism is a type of economic nihilism, one that was not intended to be an end in and of itself, but a means to an end. So Xelasoma notes that the liberalism is the meta-narrative that sees itself as distinct from all other meta-narratives, and given its own elevated status, it gives itself permission to mock all other meta-narratives and mythologies that do not fit within its domain. So, think, for example, Christianity. There's been a reason why Christianity and liberalism have kind of been at each other's throats, and I guess kind of the neutered Christianity of today kind of has to force itself to fit within these confines of liberalism in order to make sure that it still survives. So, the irony here is liberalism's failure to recognize its own status as a narrative, its own mythology. So, given the Christian mythology's central figure as the Christ, he notes liberalism's core tenet as technology. So, I think Justin Murphy made an interesting Christian accelerationist take that the second coming, the eschatological second coming, is the singularity, the eschatological end where we lose our humanity. So if the Christ figure of the liberal capitalism mythology is technology, this eschatological end would make sense under this mythology would be the singularity. So, I know that was kind of a mouthful. So under the liberal capitalist mythology, the accelerationists would probably be considered the saints, since they're the ones looking to promote it and spread it as much as possible. It's almost kind of like they'd be viewed as the saints in order to kind of spread it as much as possible, even if it is for its own eventual destruction. But Xelasoma notes Zizek's deep appreciation, apprehension of the singularity. He notes that Xelasoma notes that we are natural beings, and technology should really be viewed as anything secondary to what the natural state of man should be. So he's not a Luddite, but he emphasizes that technology, while it is a tool, it should really be used for the betterment of man instead of man enslaving himself to technology. So that's kind of my take on this, is the pre-modern take on technology was that the technology is used to serve humanity, not the other way around. And when there comes a point where the increase in GDP is not correlating with an increase in humanity's well-being, we need to reconsider what exactly is going on. So economics is a tool of humanity, not the other way around. And not to get too utilitarian, but if a tool is no longer providing utility or increasing the quality of life of the person using said tool, it should be done away with and reconfigured. I agree with Peterson and Zizek that happiness is not the goal, nor should it be. The correct response to happiness is the Kurt Vonnegut response. Muse on it and say to yourself, if this isn't nice, what is? But you shouldn't aim for it. Have a purpose beyond it and cultivate both personal and collective responsibility. So, soft ending to this episode. Maybe I'll come up with a part 2. Thank you for tuning into Glofcast.